Dark forests, flickering campfires, and the unknown lurking just beyond the trees. Camping is supposed to be an escape into nature, but for some, it became a nightmare they'll never forget. These are 3 terrifying camping horror stories that will make you think twice before venturing into the woods again. Story number 1. It was the late 90s, and we were just a bunch of high school kids looking for a weekend escape. Dirt bikes, camping gear, and the empty hills outside Redding, California. It was supposed to be fun, a wild trip we'd laugh about later. But now, I don't laugh when I think about that weekend. Some parts I can't forget, no matter how hard I try. The trip was Josh's idea. Camping, dirt bikes, booze, he'd said at lunch, and by Friday, we were packed and ready. Old trucks and a beat-up van carried our bikes and gear, bouncing along the back roads. The ride felt like freedom. Windows down, grunge tapes blaring, everyone throwing jabs and laughing. It was mostly guys, a few girls, just one of those thrown-together high school groups where no one cared about the details. Back then, it felt like nothing could go wrong. We rolled into the campsite just before sunset, a flat spot surrounded by hills and nothing else. It felt perfect. We unloaded the bikes, got the fire roaring, and cracked open the beer and whiskey before we'd even set up the first tent. By nightfall, the air was thick with the smell of campfire smoke and burnt hot dogs. For a while, it was everything we'd hoped for. Dumb games, ghost stories, and endless debates about who would win in a fight. It felt like the kind of night we'd remember forever, and we did, but not for the reasons we expected. Then, close to midnight, the night shifted. Out of the darkness, 2 guys stumbled into view, their flashlights flickering like dying stars. They looked rough, filthy clothes, jittery movements, and those glassy, far-off eyes that made your skin crawl. At first, we thought, just other campers, right? But as they got closer, we saw it, a massive razor-sharp knife catching the firelight like it had a story of its own. One of them grinned, a grin too wide, and said, "Mind if we join?" But it wasn't a question. They dropped down by our fire, like they belonged there, and every instinct screamed they didn't. It didn't take long for things to get weird. The knife guy shoved his blade into the fire, holding it there until it glowed red, the heat warping the air around it. Then, without a second thought, he pressed it to his own arm. The sickening sizzle of burning flesh cut through the night, making all of us wince. But him, he just laughed. Calmly, casually, he scraped off a chunk of his own skin and popped it into his mouth. "Keeps me strong," he said, like it was some kind of joke. We just sat there, frozen, too shocked, too terrified to say a word. His buddy started wandering around the camp, poking through our stuff like he owned the place. He didn't take anything, just picked things up, food, tools, jackets, and tossed them aside like they were trash. Then, out of nowhere, the knife guy stood up, the glowing blade still in his hand. "Where's the gas?" he barked, his voice cutting through the crackling fire. He pointed the blade straight at Josh. "We'll need it for the bikes when we leave." This time, it wasn't a question. Josh froze, stammering something about not knowing where it was. The rest of us? We just sat there. Silent. That's when his buddy found the gas can. He dragged it over, plopped down on it like it was a bench, and pulled out a cigarette. "You got a light?" he asked, a smug smirk spreading across his face. Josh hesitated, but after a moment he handed over a lighter, too scared to do anything else. The guy lit up, took a long drag, and leaned back, puffing away while the gas can shifted under his weight. "Relax," he said casually. "Gas doesn't burn unless you spark it." The knife guy burst out laughing. But the rest of us, we didn't even breathe. The tension hung in the air like a noose, tightening with every passing second. Ben and I tried to distract them with snaps, a dumb game we used to play back in school. Somehow, it worked. The knife guy leaned in, his eyes wide with fascination. "How are you doing that? Some kind of magic?" he asked, his voice low and almost reverent. "Something like that," Ben replied, his voice steady, even though I could see his hands trembling. While we kept the knife guy's attention, one of the girls leaned in close and whispered, "The bikes are chained together," and I pulled the spark plugs, just in case. Smart move, but it didn't make me feel any safer. Back at the fire, the knife guy's paranoia started to spike. He stood up abruptly, his glare locking onto Josh. "You call someone?" he snapped, his voice sharp and accusing. Josh's mouth opened, but no words came out. Then we all heard it, a low rumble in the distance, an engine. Relief washed over me for a moment, but the knife guy whipped around, his eyes darting wildly into the darkness. The tension broke, but it didn't feel like we were safe. Not yet. Headlights pierced through the trees, flooding the camp with harsh light as a truck rolled in, its engine idling. The knife guy stiffened, his grip tightening around the blade, his knuckles white. Out stepped a park ranger, his silhouette sharp against the glare. His flashlight swept across us like a searchlight. "Evening, folks," he said casually, his voice steady but firm, one hand resting just a little too comfortably near his sidearm. "Everything okay here?" The tension was suffocating. None of us dared to breathe, waiting to see what would happen next. The tweakers exchanged quick, nervous glances. The knife guy muttered something under his breath, low and sharp, then suddenly drove the glowing blade into the dirt. Without another word, he backed away into the shadows, his buddy trailing behind him like a ghost. They disappeared into the darkness, leaving us in stunned silence. The ranger stayed for a while, his flashlight scanning the camp as he asked questions we couldn't fully answer. By the time he left, the fire was nothing but embers, and we didn't need to talk about it. We all knew it was time to go. At first light, we packed up and rode out, the engines breaking the eerie silence of the morning. We didn't stop until we hit the main road, and no one said much. None of us needed to. We all knew we'd dodged something that could have gone horribly wrong. Even now, I still think about that knife guy, the way he smiled as he ate his own flesh, or his buddy puffing away on a gas can like it was nothing. Those memories still keep me up at night, because I know just how close we came to being nothing more than another campfire story. Story number 2. It was the summer I turned 15, and my cousin Eric decided to drag me along on one of his camping trips. He was 20, full of confidence, and always looking for adventure. His best friend Danny came too, a loud, jokey kind of guy who loved messing with me at every opportunity. I was the tag-along, the kid they could laugh at while pretending to teach me about the great outdoors. We set up camp deep in Bear Creek Forest, miles from the nearest ranger station. Eric called it the perfect spot, far enough to feel like we were in the middle of nowhere, but close enough to the trails that we wouldn't get lost. The first night was fun. Campfire stories, bad jokes, and way too many s'mores. But the second night, that's when things got weird. It started with Danny's bright idea to take a walk down one of the trails after dark. "Come on, it'll be fun," he said, grinning. "We'll see if you can handle it, kid. Don't worry, we'll protect you from the big bad wolf, or Bigfoot." Eric smirked. "Yeah, maybe Bigfoot wants to hang out tonight." "Very funny," I muttered, grabbing my flashlight. The forest was different at night. The cheerful chirps and rustling sounds from earlier in the day were gone, replaced by an eerie, oppressive silence. Every step felt too loud, every shadow too long. We hadn't gone far, maybe 10 minutes down the trail, when Danny started shining his flashlight into the trees. "What was that?" he said, his voice mock serious. "What?" I froze, looking where his light pointed. "Relax," he laughed, giving me a playful shove. "You're so jumpy, kid. What are you gonna do if Bigfoot really shows up?" "Cut it out," I said, my face flushing. But then we heard it, a faint whisper drifting through the trees. "Did you hear that?" I asked, stopping dead in my tracks. Danny grinned. "It's probably Bigfoot or maybe the wind." He cupped his hands around his mouth and howled. "Hello? Anyone out there?" "Danny, knock it off," Eric hissed. We kept walking, but the whispering grew louder. It wasn't random like leaves rustling. It was deliberate. Words, soft and broken, but definitely human. We froze, flashlights darting into the darkness. "Who's there?" Eric called, his voice sharp. No response, just the whispering, circling us like it was coming from everywhere at once. Then, in the beam of my flashlight, I saw it. A figure on the ground, crawling toward us. She was low to the earth, her limbs moving with an unnatural, jerky rhythm. Her hair was wild, tangled with twigs, and her clothes hung loose, smeared with dirt. Danny's smirk vanished. "What the hell?" he whispered, stepping back. My heart slammed against my ribs as a single word ran through my mind. "Witch." Eric's flashlight shook in his hand. "What is that?" he muttered, his voice barely audible. We didn't move. We couldn't. My legs felt like they were made of lead, my body frozen between the primal urge to run and the terror of drawing attention. The whispers stopped as she lifted her head. Her face was pale, almost glowing in the light. Her eyes were wide, unblinking. Then she smiled, slow and deliberate, and said in a low, rasping voice, "I'm looking for my campsite." The spell broke. Eric exhaled sharply, and Danny let out a nervous laugh that sounded more like a whimper. Are you okay?" Eric asked, his flashlight still trained on her. She pushed herself to her feet, swaying unsteadily. Up close, she looked even worse. Scratches covered her arms, and her hands were streaked with dried blood. The smell of sweat, alcohol, and something else, something sour, drifted off her. "I got lost," she said, her words slurring. I was trying to find the bathroom, and then..." Her voice trailed off as her eyes darted nervously to the trees. "Were you crawling?" I asked, my voice trembling. She didn't answer, just blinked at me like she didn't understand the question. Eric cleared his throat. "Okay, let's get you back to the main campsite," Danny muttered. "Yeah, let's get her there before she starts doing that again." But he didn't argue. The three of us fell into step around her as we led her back down the trail. The walk back was tense. She stumbled often, her muttering growing louder before trailing off into silence. Every so often she'd glance over her shoulder like she thought something was following her. I couldn't help but do the same. When we reached the campground, most of the sites were dark, but a small group near the edge was still awake, gathered around a smoldering fire. "Hey!" Eric called out. "Is she with you?" One of the guys, tall, wearing a baseball cap, stood up, his face twisted in confusion. "Julie, where have you been?" The woman, Julie, staggered toward him without a word. She sank into a chair by the fire, burying her face in her hands. The guy, who introduced himself as Mike, shook his head. She was supposed to be in her tent. Must have wandered off. "She was crawling in the woods," Danny said flatly. "You might want to keep a closer eye on her." Mike muttered a sheepish thanks, promising to watch her more carefully. As we walked back to our site, the adrenaline started to fade, replaced by exhaustion and a lingering unease. "She's lucky we found her," Eric said, breaking the silence. Another hour out there and she could have. He trailed off, shaking his head. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her crawling toward us, whispering in the dark. And I couldn't stop thinking about the way she kept looking over her shoulder, like she wasn't just lost, but running from something. Story number 3. I've always been drawn to places that feel forgotten by the world. A few years ago, I decided to camp at an old site I'd heard about, a small, overgrown campground deep in the national forest. It used to have a few cabins, a main building, and even an outside toilet, but now it was abandoned, reclaimed by the forest. I'd been there once before and knew it was perfect. The main building, though dilapidated, was still standing and could be used for shelter if the weather turned bad. I packed my gear, a small cooler of food, and set out for a weekend of solitude. The first day was idyllic. I set up my tent near the main building, cooked dinner over a small campfire, and enjoyed the kind of quiet you only find in the middle of nowhere. My meal was simple: canned stew, a couple of sausages, and a cheap beer to wash it down. I didn't think much of it at the time. That night, the weather turned. By midnight, the wind was howling, and the rain came down in torrents, drumming against the walls of my tent. I huddled in my sleeping bag, trying to ignore the storm raging outside. Then my stomach started to churn. At first, I thought it was just nerves from the storm, but the cramps quickly became unbearable. I cursed myself, realizing the sausages I'd eaten might not have been as fresh as I thought. The cooler hadn't kept them cold enough during the drive, and now I was paying the price. I needed to get to the outhouse. There was no way I could handle this inside the tent. I pulled on my boots and rain jacket, grabbed my flashlight, and stepped into the storm. The wind immediately slammed into me, nearly knocking me off balance. Rain lashed at my face, and the beam of my flashlight barely cut through the darkness. The outhouse was about 50 yards from my tent, near the edge of the old campsite. It was small and rickety, but it was my only option. I trudged through the mud, each step sinking into the soaked ground. By the time I reached the outhouse, the wind was so strong I had to shove the door open with my shoulder. Inside, it was cramped and smelled like wet wood and decay. I sat down, my flashlight resting on the floor, and tried to focus on the sound of the rain instead of the twisting pain in my stomach. Then I heard a loud crack, followed by a low, groaning thump. The sound came from the direction of my tent. My stomach dropped. I froze, listening as the storm roared around me, but there were no other sounds, just the wind and rain. The rational part of me told myself it was just a branch falling, but something about the weight of that sound didn't feel right. I stayed in the outhouse for a few more minutes, the cramped space somehow feeling safer than braving the storm. When I finally opened the door, the rain had eased up slightly, though the wind still whipped through the trees. I shined my flashlight toward the clearing where my tent was and stopped cold. A massive tree had fallen, its trunk crushing my tent into the ground. My gear, my sleeping bag, everything. I couldn't even see it under the wreckage. I just stood there, the flashlight shaking in my hand, as the realization hit me. If I hadn't left for the outhouse when I did, I wouldn't be standing there at all. I had no choice but to take shelter in the old main building. The door creaked loudly as I pushed it open, and the inside smelled of mildew and rot. The windows were cracked, letting in the wind, but the walls were solid enough. I sat on an overturned crate in the corner, wrapping myself in a spare jacket I'd grabbed before leaving the tent. My mind raced, replaying the sound of the tree falling over and over. The storm had nearly killed me, and I hadn't even realized it. By the time the rain stopped, it was nearly dawn. I stepped outside and stared at the remains of my tent. The tree's massive trunk was splintered where it had snapped, and the branches sprawled out like a giant broken hand. I couldn't bring myself to move the wreckage. I just packed what little I had left and started the long hike back to my car. When I reached the trailhead, the storm had cleared completely. The morning sun broke through the trees, warming the forest and making everything glisten. It was beautiful, but I didn't feel at peace. I thought about how close I'd come to staying in that tent, how one small, unlucky decision, eating those bad sausages, had somehow saved my life. I still camp, but I've never been back to that old site. And now, I check the dates on everything I pack. And that's the end of our campfire tales. Or is it? Remember, the woods hold secrets, and not all of them want to stay hidden.